Chapter 5 Head Games. If the legends and lore surrounding Lamech were thin, well, Nimrod is fat with legends and lore. The amount of material surrounding him was quite impressive, and in doing studies into the time period, things kept coming back to him again and again and again. So, who is Nimrod? Like Lamech, he's another prehistoric king, which doesn't necessarily mean he's a caveman, but that we didn't have modern historical records about him. Sure, we have Genesis, but the rest of the facts about him come from interpretations of mythology and archaeology. Someone writing a research paper? This is problematic. For me, it's perfect. The first thing to know about Nimrod involves the time period. He's born after the flood and is listed as the great-grandson of Noah. Being born after the flood means we're dealing with the same world, the same geography, and the same civilizations we have when the real historians show up. While the timeline isn't written in stone, it gives you some specific years and details to show he was the great-grandson of Noah. So when you match up their genealogies and factor in the BC dates from the historians, you get a rough birth date of about 2000 BC. There are some Christian scholars who insist on these genealogies being hyperbolic, which means they are exaggerated or symbolic of eras. That could be. This hyperbolic interpretation allows human history to stretch back thousands to millions of years if each name is an era. A literal interpretation of the timeline means the flood happened about 2400 BC, so the world of Nimrod would be in that rebuild phase. For a few centuries, it was the Wild Wild West. Here's how Genesis 10 described Nimrod. Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And unto them were sons born after the flood. And the sons of Ham, Cush, and Mizraim, and Put, and Canaan. And the sons of Cush, Seba, and Havilah, and Sabta, and Rama, and Sabekta. And the sons of Rama, Sheba, and Dedan. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the world. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, by who I'm not sure, therefore it is said, even as Nimrod the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. Out of that land went forth Ashur, and builded Nineveh, and the city of Rehoboth, and Calah, and Rezin. Between Nineveh and Calah, the same is a great city. And Mizraim began Ludim, and Anamim, and Lehabim, and Naphtahim, and Patharusim, and Calhushim, out of whom were called the Philistine, and the Caphorthortim. A lot of hemes. Chronicles even briefly mentions Nimrod in verse 10. And Cush began Nimrod. He began to be mighty upon the earth. Nimrod the Mighty. If you're skimming through all the names in Genesis 10, it's easy to shrug off the significance of Nimrod and his mighty description. Remember mythology? Well, I've seen several Bible scholars who jump all over the concept of Nimrod being a hunter. Guess who else is a hunter during this time period? Orion. One quick look at the legends and scholars make note at the bottom of the page that Nimrod was from the legendary era described in Greek mythology. After all, when Homer wrote it down in 800 BC, he was describing stuff that had happened centuries earlier. Orion was mighty. Orion was a hunter. Orion equals Nimrod? Sure. Okay. Having already done a study on King David and giants, I sat up when I came across the old Hebrew word Gibor. Ooh, cool word, huh? This word pops up again and again and again in association with giants. Remember the angels plus women equals giants stuff from Genesis 6? The children were described as Gabor. Now, I'm not going to ignore the fact that the word Gabor is used synonymous with warriors elsewhere. Yet it seems that this word became an epic metaphor. Instead of saying he was a literal evil donkey, he was metaphorically an evil donkey. A badass. Okay. During the time of King David, when he was literally hunting giants, he assembled a team of giant killers. The name of his crack kill squad? The Gabor. So literally and figuratively, the word Gabor has connections to giants. So was Nimrod a Gabor that hunted? Or did Nimrod hunt Gabor? Both theories work. It's the mythology era after all. Nimrod, the architect. Even though Chronicles shrugs it off, Genesis goes deeper into the fact that Nimrod was a builder. Now, even though I grew up in the country, I have nothing against cities. Yet cities are places of protection because you are afraid. You're afraid of the weather, other tribes, the wild animals, or those pesky giants that ate your cousins last week. Afraid. Being filled with fear makes you easy pickings for Satan. Nineveh? Yep, a great city that existed for centuries, but ultimately so filled with fear that Jonah chooses death rather than going there. Nimrod built many great cities, but I assume fear was at the heart of it. There are several names listed that are dead ends, but two names aren't. Babel and Mizraim. Now, Mizraim might be a head-scratcher, but it was the old term for Egypt. You know Egypt, the place with amazing architecture. Yes, there are scholars out there who have speculated that the Egyptian builder Imhotep might also be Nimrod, since the two eras overlap so closely. So Nimrod equals Imhotep? If so, then it explains how the pyramids suddenly popped up with an almost divine precision and perfection. Yet Nimrod built something much more impressive than a pyramid. What's the city of Babel famous for? A tower. Okay, it doesn't actually say it, but a few verses down it does give the Tower of Babel story. Lore connects the rest. So if Imhotep equals Nimrod equals tower, we should take a peek at what some of the lore says about this time period. There was an ancient historian named Berosus who wrote about ancient times, and his lost works were referenced by other historians. Hey, no smoking inside the Library of Alexandria. How many times have I warned you kids? His accounts are kind of goofy and fun. You ready? According to Berosus, the Tower of Babel was built by giant creatures known as the Anunnaki, who are described as giants. That's right, human bulldozers. His account goes on to say that Pandora, the girl with the box, was the daughter-in-law of Noah. Also, he mentions that along with the tower, another ancient monument, and this is where I get interested, Esagila, was built during the time period. Its name translates as House of the Raised Head. Trust me, we'll get back to that later. Now, there are other accounts that connect Nimrod to the Tower of Babel, but this one involves Gabor. Does that mean Nimrod was a giant? Or does that mean Nimrod wasn't just skilled at hunting elk and possum, but also Gabor? If he was famous for hunting giants, what did he do with these giants? He enslaved them and forced them to build stuff like the Tower of Babel, cities, and the pyramids. How Norse is that? How ancient aliens is that? The Tower of Nimrod. Okay, Genesis doesn't connect the dots for us. It mentions Nimrod. Words, words, words. Then it mentions the Tower of Babel. Now, just based on lifespans and generations, you can easily speculate that the founder of Babel would still be around during the construction of the tower. If we set the flood date at 1656 AC, after creation, okay, then Arphaxad was born in 1658 and lived until 2096, since he lived 438 years. Noah's great-grandson, Salah, born in 1693, lived 433 years, thus dies in 2126. Great-grandson, Eber, born in 1723, lives 464 years and dies in the year 2187. Nimrod is born during this time period, which means he could have ruled for hundreds of years. Want a wacky fact? Abraham, 10 generations later, was born in 2008. Noah died in 2006 AC. There is some major overlapping going on here. There'd also be a population boom. Each generation loses ground on the lifespan battle until we finally arrive at normal humans following Abraham. Notice how the Genesis narratives goes from the Tower of Babel and right into the tale of Abraham. I believe it's because Abraham was alive and active during the Tower of Babel incident. He leaves Ur, which is Babel, because of Nimrod and the tower. But that's another Bible study. So when you picture the tower narrative, read it with both Nimrod and Abram in mind. Here's Genesis 11:1. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore it is called of the name Babel, because the Lord did confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of the earth. Okay, so the nuts and the bolts of this is that God wanted them to spread out over the earth 2.0. The people said no, built a tower, and then God showed up and said, You're going. For me, there's a ton of unanswered questions in this section of text that has nothing to do with the mysteries of the language. What's the rush? Who united them? And why build a tower? The answer to the first question is actually provided in Genesis, albeit not directly. When you look at the lifespans, you can see that something dramatic happens during generation 5. Peleg's lifespan is cut in half. While generation 6 and 7 follow suit, it drops again. And after Abraham, things get to a normal 120th cap. My speculation is that the environment changed dramatically. Heck, to believe in the flood, I have to speculate a ton of dramatic climate change involving ice ages, for the floodwaters, earthquakes, erosion, and rising sea levels. Both Genesis and Chronicles associate Peleg with the earth was divided. Huh? There are a couple ways you could take this phrase. Are we talking Babel? A language division? That certainly does the trick. But remember, God only messed with the language because he had a reason for them to rush, right? So I think the dividing of the earth likely means geography. When I was a kid, I'd often marvel at the continental shelf and ponder a world with slightly lower water levels. As an adult, I ponder rising ocean levels and imagine the inverse. Perhaps the days of Peleg means that something really bad happened. A huge volcano, meteor, temperatures that caused the ice caps to melt and glug, 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 fill the world up to its recently stable status quo. God gave Noah's family a few basic commands. Be fruitful, spread out. So when Nimrod's generation said nope, God had to get involved before the clock ran out. In this most conservative of timelines, humanity only had a few hundred years between the flood and the Peleg disaster to get to land bridge places like Australia, England, and America. Who and why? My answer wasn't found in legends and lore. Instead, it was found in a historical document. I tease history often, since history is written by the conquerors in most cases. But 2,000 years ago, there was a Roman/Jewish historian named Josephus who wrote a huge book on the history of the world from a Jewish perspective. Granted, you never know how much is accurate, but nevertheless, it gives us fantastic insights into what folks thought back in the time of Jesus. As it turns out, Josephus has a big explanation for the Tower of Babel. So this is what he says. Now in the plain in which they first dwelt was called Shinar. God also commanded them to send colonies abroad for the thorough peopling of the earth, that they might not raise seditions amongst themselves, but might cultivate a great part of the earth, and enjoy its fruits after a plentiful manner. But they were so ill-instructed that they did not obey God, for which reason they fell into calamities, and were made sensible by experience of what sin they had been found guilty of. For when they flourished with a numerous youth, God admonished them, again sending out colonies. But they, imagining the prosperity they enjoyed was not derived from the favor of God, but supposing that their own power was the cause of their plentiful condition they were in, did not obey him. Nay, they added to this disobedience to the divine will the suspicion that they were therefore ordered to send out separate colonies, that, being divided asunder, they might be more easily oppressed. Now it was Nimrod that excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man and of great strength of hand. He persuaded them not to ascribe it to God, as if it were through his means that they were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured that happiness. He also gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into a constant dependence on his own power. He also said he would be revenged on God if he should have a mind to drown the world again. For that, he would build a tower too high for the waters to be able to reach, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers? Now, the multitude were very ready to follow the determination of Nimrod, and to esteem it a piece of cowardice to submit to God. And they built a tower, neither sparing any pains nor in any degree diligent. And by reason of the multitude of hands employed in it, it grew very high, sooner than anyone could expect. But the thickness of it was so great, and it was so strongly built, that thereby its great height seemed, upon the view, to be less than it really was. It was built of burnt brick, cementing together with mortar, built of bitumen, that it might not be liable to admit water. When God saw that they acted so madly, he did not resolve to destroy them utterly, since they were not grown wiser by the destruction of the former sinners. But he caused a tumult among them, by producing in them diverse languages, and causing that through the multitude of those languages they should not be able to understand one another. The place wherein they built the tower is now called Babylon, because of the confusion of that language which they readily understood before. For the Hebrews mean by the word Babel confusion. The Sibyl also makes mention of this tower, and of the confusion of the language when she says thus, "When all men were of one language, some of them built a high tower, as if they thereby could ascend up into heaven. But the gods sent storms of winds and overthrew the tower, and gave everyone in his peculiar language. And this reason it was that the city was called Babylon. But as to the plain of Shinar, in the country of Babylonia, Hestasius mentions it when he says thus, such as the priests as were saved took the sacred vessels of Jupiter and Aeolus and came to Shinar of Babylon." Wow. Josephus makes all sorts of stuff that includes all sorts of stuff that Genesis didn't mention. Why? I mean, from his perspective, he's not making stuff up. Look how he ends. He cites sources. Just like I discover, there's a ton of old legends and lore involving Nimrod, and Josephus just summarizes these tales. So, what did we learn in the opening part? God wanted folks to spread out on the earth. Folks willfully disobeyed. The nomads were faithful. The city builders were bad. Why? They believed in God, but distrusted him because of the flood. So, Nimrod uses this to unify them. Apparently, Nimrod is a mighty warrior, and as the biggest, baddest guy in the room, he acts as a bully. Then things get really, really dark. These folks readily believe God is real, but they blame him for what happened in the flood. They distrust him. They assume he'll do it again. So behind Nimrod's leadership, they plan to kill God. I mean, yes, the tower is a type of flood insurance. They built it so as if it floods again, they'll be able to climb up on it and escape the water. I guess this motivation explains why they built a tower. Nimrod doesn't just use slave labor. He gets volunteers who are afraid of drowning. Yet, they have another motivation for building the tower. God lives in heaven, right? Heaven is up, right? God used to speak to Adam and Eve through a window in heaven, right? God opened a window in heaven to flood the world, right? So Nimrod does some calculating and decides that if they build this epic ladder, they'll be able to invade heaven and, as he said, avenge himself on God. I mean, this sounds like some bad Marvel Comics plot. If you're looking for a qualification to be the Antichrist, this move seems to be enough. Ultimately, Nimrod's kill God plan is defeated by God. By defeating them with language, our differences suddenly keep us from uniting against our Creator. God distracts us, and we turn on each other. We deserved a spanking for this, and he spanks us with language? It's an ironic punishment. God decided it wasn't time to have an emperor of the world, and save that for the end times, when language will no longer be an impediment, thanks to Google Translate. General Abram the Tank. Genesis doesn't give much clarity about Nimrod's role in the tower incident, nor does it give much clarity about this era's number one hero, Abram. Where was Abram born? Babel. Where did Nimrod rule? Babel. The Abram story begins without motivation as we see him packing up his family and moving 700 miles away from Babel. What's going on in Babel? Nimrod stuff. There's an entire book worth of stuff about Abram versus Nimrod, but for the sake of brevity, I'll save that for another day. Just know that in his youth, Abram is neck deep in his opposition to Nimrod. It reads just like Moses versus Pharaoh. In fact, there's even a popular Spanish folk song that tells the story of Nimrod and Abraham. Its lyrics are, "When King Nimrod went out in the fields, looked at the heavens and the stars, he saw a holy light in the Jewish quarter, a sign that Abraham, our father, was about to be born." Strangely, when we are introduced to Abram in Genesis 12, he's being rewarded by God with the promise that God will make thee a great nation. Aside from being born in Ur, aka Babel, what did he do to warrant this? See, it doesn't explain the early years of Abraham at all, does it? While folks in Spain were singing the answer, I was scratching my head in South Dakota trying to understand the early motivations and deeds of Abram. What did that guy do? That Spanish song is rooted in Hebrew legends and lore. You know, mythology. These are tales that are as old as the Trojan War and the Olympians, but it doesn't mean any of this stuff is accurate. Get my drift? These accounts are found in the Talmud and the Pseudo-Philo. I include it because this odd puzzle piece seems to fit other legends. Here's the recap. Nimrod's grandfather tries to kill him at birth. Yeesh. Nimrod marries a woman named Semiramis. Evil alert, evil alert. A portent, a sign or an omen, predicts the birth of Abraham. Abram. Abram's mother escapes and secretly gives birth. Bethlehem copyright. Abram recognizes God from an early age, despite growing up in evil Ur or Babel. And then round one. God sends Abram to warn Nimrod about idolatry. Cool. Round two. Nimrod gathers wood for 4 years and then attempts to burn Abram alive. But the fires do not harm Abram. Which brings us to round three. Nimrod fights Abram in open battle. General Abram? Despite inferior numbers, God destroys Nimrod's forces with an army of gnats. And a gnat goes in Nimrod's brain and drives him all sorts of Chekhov crazy. As a peace treaty, Nimrod gives Abram his slave, Eliezer. That guy? Finally, Abram leaves Mesopotamia for the Promised Land. Too good to be true? Perhaps. But it does expand a bunch of things that we find in Genesis that have no setup or explanation. Remember Abraham's heir problem? The parts about Ishmael and Isaac are often discussed, but if you look closely, he almost promotes Eleazar, not a relative, as his heir. Who? The folklore explains where this guy came from. Nimrod. Shortly after Abram settles in Canaan, Lot is taken prisoner during the War of the Nine Kings. Who are these guys? Where did they come from? I'm betting that these guys are the former allies of Abram when they went to war with Nimrod. After the successful war with Nimrod, they clean up the giants before turning on each other in the vacuum left by Nimrod. In this chaos, Lot is accidentally taken prisoner. When Abraham learns his nephew has been kidnapped, he puts on his war paint, unburies the hatchet, and whoops some. Abraham has mad military skills. And how do you acquire those? See the above story. So somewhere in all of this early life plot of Abram, the Tower of Babel happens. It makes sense to happen during this time period. This leaves Nimrod totally defeated and without a tower or army. Just like God drew Moses from the water to deal with Pharaoh, it seems Abram is the counterweight to evil Nimrod. Mapping Nimrod's mythology. Time to roll up my sleeves. One of the games and activities that I always played in my mythology class was the Farmer in Western Kansas activity, where you read a 2-paragraph story about a farmer, a tornado, and a bad dad joke. Like the phone game, each kid would pass the story to the next blind listener, and so forth. I liked it because it replicated how a fact could be dramatically changed by omission and addition. By the time we got to the final contemporary tale-teller, the story was a hot mess. Yet, at its core, bits of truth. I feel like there are bits of truth about Nimrod found in all of these legends. The names and details got changed, but they all seem to be telling the same story. I'll go through them in no particular order. Perk de Rabbi Eleazar. Not sure what that means. In this telling, there is a fascinating connection to the pre-flood world. In it, Nimrod inherits the garments of Adam and Eve. Remember the fruit? Well, shortly after Adam and Eve ate it, God called them together and naked. So he does something wise and horrible. He clothes them. How? He kills one of his creations to clothe them. Were these magical, immortal animals? Heck, they might have been the original unicorns. Not a rhino. Regardless, these garments were passed down, brought onto the ark, and then found their way into the hands of a hunter. Ah, that's dark symbolism. Later in this narrative, Nimrod defeats the armies of Japheth to create universal rule, which makes him the original emperor of the earth. The ending of the narrative is a tad odd. In it, Esau ambushes him, robs him, and then beheads him. This reminds me a lot of that Cain, Lamech, Song of the Sword narrative we had read. The beheading is also a dark rabbit hole theory I'll get to in a bit. Kitab al-Magal is an Arabic narrative. In this tale, Nimrod has magic. The non-biblical fourth son of Noah, Boundater, teaches young Nimrod the powers of divination. What's that? Looking into the future might have motivated Nimrod the same way it motivated Nebuchadnezzar. Seeing the bookend prophecy involving fire or the Antichrist might have made him motivated to change this future, and voila, the Tower of Babel plan. This narrative builds on the idea that Nimrod was an engineer, an architect that created cities. The most unique aspect was that as the first king, he also chose to wear a crown. Pause. Why do we wear crowns? Scratching skull? Halo? Wow, we're really trying to restore our former glow, or we're trying to appear like the angels. Nimrod wears a halo to spite his mortality and to celebrate his lost divinity. Not only does Nimrod create the crown concept, but then he creates a flag, a piece of black cloth with his golden crown upon it. Stray theory. Gold is precious. Science believes gold is alien to Earth and was created by a supernova that scattered traces of it throughout the universe. Translation? It's special. Reading the Ethiopian tales of creation, it seems gold was a vital part of Eden and the holy mountain of God. Want something biblical? Read Ezekiel 28:13-14. My point is, the holy mountain of God was destroyed by the flood, and the gold was scattered. How Nimrod-y would it be to gather up that gold? Each fleck is a reminder of what we lost. Speaking of, The conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan is that Ethiopian version of Genesis that I've referenced prior. Again, it has all sorts of stray theories and concepts, and in it, it mentions Santal, who is a crown maker and is taught by Noah's fourth son, this time named Barvin. What's up with the fourth son situation? The Cave of Treasures is an Arabic text that's old yet recently discovered, making it apocryphal and pseudepigraphical. Yet it adds to the legend by mentioning the fourth son of Noah. In this story, he is named Yontan. So something major certainly happened during this fourth generation, which is when Nimrod ruled. While we don't get much about Nimrod, we also get another crown story. In this narrative, Sison is credited as being the original weaver of a crown. The Book of Recognitions comes close to being a Nimrod story. In this Greek text, it describes King Ninus, who rules Assyria. Where's Assyria? Yup, the Tigris and Euphrates place, just like ancient Babylon. Oh, and it says that Ninus was the guy who founded Nineveh. So, Ninus equals Nimrod? Got it. The most interesting tidbit brought up by this text is that King N is the origin of the Zoroaster story? Who? Oh, baby. Zoroaster, also known as Zarathustra, is the founder of an ancient religion, remember that one, with origins thousands of years BC. That places us in Nimrod's era. Zoroastrianism is not only a religion that survives to today, but its theories go all over the place. I've come across Zoroaster lore when reading alchemy origin stories and also when reading Christian, Jewish, and Islamic theories about those founding fathers of Genesis 10. If Nimrod did indeed become an emperor who was defeated by God/Abram the Tank, then his followers likely would not have simply let it go. Stuff for thought here. Abu al-Faida adds that in the language reset, Eber, Hebrews, got to keep the original language since they didn't give aid to the building of the tower. In that account, it establishes that Nimrod rules for 500 years, which makes sense for the time period, and introduced the fundamentals of astrology. This narrative also builds on the legend of Abraham, which has Nimrod trying to Herod the child. A Hungarian legend has some fascinating information. In this account, they use the name Menrot when describing him, but build on the idea that Nimrod was in fact a literal giant. Their story is about how Cam became the father of the Hungarians and involves a legend of the white stag. Anyway, it adds that the tower was built 201 years after the flood. Cam and his wife N moved to a place called Evelet, where they give birth to twins, Hunar and Magyar. These boys go on. Speak here. These boys go on to become the founding fathers of the Huns and Hungarians. During the hunt for the white stag, Esau is brought up again as the guy who kills and beheads Nimrod. The repetition of Esau is curious, and so too is the beheaded legend, which I'll get to later. Tidbits. There are a few more random facts that I found interesting that pile on a few more details and theories, such as Ninus equaling Zoroaster, who equals Sargon, who equals Marduk, who equals Ninurta, who's the same as Baal, who's similar to Osiris, who's similar to Belus, etc. It's a fat legend. Sefer HaYashar adds a detail that Nimrod's son is named Mardan and is made wicked. We'll circle back to the child of Nimrod detail. The History of Prophets and Kings text echoes the idea that Nimrod was the builder of the Tower of Babel and that Allah destroyed it. Now, this fires up an interesting thought. If the tower was big enough to reach the window of heaven, what happened after the language snafu? Nothing is mentioned in Genesis. Earthquake, lightning storm. The Armenians mention that Haik defeated Nimrod, but also associate the name Bel, which is another rabbit hole. The Quran adds the detail that Nimrod released 2 death sentence prisoners. Finally, Ephraim the Syrian flips the script and says Nimrod was righteous and didn't want the tower. There's always another point of view, huh? So you can see the tip of the iceberg. At one point, Nimrod was a known villain. He's seeped into our culture through Bugs Bunny, who called Elmer Fudd, a hunter, a Nimrod. Freemason lore credits Nimrod as one of the fraternity's founders. Dante mentions Nimrod in his section on giants. The rest faded into oblivion, yet the most alarming of all these tales is the implication of his wife. So let's meet the missus. The original Queen of Heaven. The prophet Jeremiah knows the story. He understands the horrible line that the Hebrews crossed when they worshipped the gods of their enemies. In fact, he brings up "she who shall not be named" during one of his famous chides. So check out Jeremiah 44, verse 15. Then all the men which knew that their wives had burnt incense unto the other gods, and all the women that stood by, a great multitude, even all the people that dwelt in the land of Egypt, in Pathros, answered Jeremiah, saying, As for the word that thou hast spoken unto us in the name of the Lord, we will not hearken unto thee, but we will certainly do whatsoever thing goeth forth out of our mouth, to burn incense unto the Queen of Heaven, and to pour out drink offerings unto her, as we have done, we and our fathers, our kings, and our princes, in the cities of Judah, and in the streets of Jerusalem. For then had we plenty of victuals, and were well, and saw no evil. But since we left off to burn incense to the Queen of Heaven, and to pour out drink offerings unto her, we have wanted all things, and we have been consumed by the sword and by the famine. And when we burned incense to the Queen of Heaven, and poured out drink offerings unto her, did we make her cakes to worship her, and pour out drink offerings unto her without our men. Jeremiah believes that the bad stuff happening is all because folks worshipped the Queen of Heaven. So who is she? From what I've found, the source of this legend goes back to the Queen of Babel, the wife of Nimrod, a woman named Semiramis. Because, after all, if Nimrod equals Ninus, and Ninus equals Zerosir, and Zerosir equals Osiris, and Osiris equals Imhotep, and Imhotep equals Baal, then Semiramis equals Isis, Isis equals Ishtar, Ishtar equals Asarte, Asarte equals Anath, and Anath, of course, equals Kali. We'll get to that another time. Now, with an equation like the one above, you must understand that there are no hard facts with mythology. I only began my study of the time period in recent years, and sure enough, there were plenty of scholars before me trying to connect the equation Nimrod plus Semiramis equals trouble. There's actually much more archaeological backstory for her than there is for Nimrod. The story behind Semiramis is that she had a divine origin. Apparently, she had some sort of fish goddess mother. Remember this when we get to the last chapter. Fish Mom. Well, Fish Mom abandons her child in a field, and a mythological miracle happens. The artist formerly known as Prince saves her. Well, kinda. Well, not really. But at the sound of crying, doves show up. And bring her food. Prince, I try. Okay. In another mythology trope, a lonely farmer stumbles across poor Semiramis and finds the child. Later, She upgrades and marries a warrior. This warrior eventually becomes the right-hand man of King Nimrod. Problem: Nimrod lusts after her. And in classic David Bathsheba Uriah storytelling, Nimrod pressures the guy until he commits suicide. Then Nimrod marries her. Now, just like the Tower of Babel story indicates, their empire expands. Her name and likeness is carved into ancient buildings all over the region. Her MO is to seduce, and if denied, conquer any rival kings. See Era the Handsome. So both her sexuality and warrior status spreads through the region. Ironically, despite her rampant sexuality, she's often portrayed as a virgin warrior. Virgin warrior? Yep, many scholars believe she is the inspiration behind deities like Athena, Aneth, and Kali. Again, if folks in this era live for a few hundred years, it makes sense why her reign of conquest lasted 42 years, and she conquered a triangle of territory ranging from Libya to Ethiopia to India. Her influence is also seen during her reign. She instituted the concept of castration for her male priests, child sacrifices, and chastity belts. Her religion included the concept of confession, since she was a medium, a go-between to the gods. To maintain power, she developed a secret society within normal society. Yep, the original deep state. If it wasn't dark enough, things take a dramatically dark twist. In the middle of her reign, Nimrod dies in private. The general public doesn't know their king is dead. Did I forget to tell you that several years earlier, she and Nimrod had a son, which she kept secretly hidden from the public? Why would she do that? Mwahaha! Her grand scheme was to show the power of resurrection. Once she got things ready, she revealed to her people that King Nimrod was indeed dead. She likely proved it by then burning him on a pyre. And then, presto, she brings him back to life again in the form of their son, Nimrod 2.0. And then she commits incest with her son, the prince. We'll hear this again, I know, in a later chapter with another Queen of Heaven story. Now, this is where other mythologies come into play. In Egyptian mythology, Isis loses her husband Osiris, collects his body parts, and presto, Osiris 2.0. In Canaanite mythology, Aneth loses her brother, she collects the body parts, he transforms into a bull, thus the Exodus golden calf, rapes her, and her child becomes, you got it, Baal 2.0. The ancient art is all over the place when you see the queen suckling her prince. The Isis and Horus/Osiris art later became synonymous with the Madonna and Child. Ew, I know. Blame it on the painters. Prior to Shem killing Nimrod, she had privately given birth to his child. In resurrecting Nimrod, she took Child as husband. So while all this is going on, you have the Tower of Babel, the days of Peleg, and Abram running around. Pretty intense era, huh? The House of the Raised Head. As interesting as I find Nimrod and Semiramis, there are a few aspects that especially resonate with me. I discovered these mysterious aspects when I was reading about Alexander the Great. In his chapter, he conquered the region, and when he gets to Babylon, he fixates on a few items. One of the projects was the restoration of Esagila. Esagila? Well, it turns out that it doesn't really matter, because as soon as Alexander returns from his trip to India, he gets poisoned, and his right-hand man not only executes his family, but also undoes all the work made on Esagila. Oh, now I really need to know more about Esagila. You? The wildest thing about ancient Babylon is that its history can be easily located. To find Esagila, you start at ancient Babylon, where you could still find the Ishtar Gate and the general area for the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Oh, strike that. According to Diodorus, they were originally called the Hanging Gardens of Semiramis. Recognize her. Anyway, go south past the Edamankanaki, which is rumored to be the inspiration for the Tower of Babel. Yep. Just a bit past that, you'll find the dust and rubble belonging to Esagila. The term Esagila has a few translation variations. Some believe it translates as temple whose top is lofty, which certainly has Tower of Babel tones. The more curious translation is House of the Raised Head. The earliest builders believed the location belonged to the gods, and thus they deserve to have a new temple built there, and to build it tall enough to raise that head up where it belongs. Rather than just shrugging and chalking it all up to Tower of Babel lore, I kept going down the rabbit hole. In my literary journey for my book series, I went down the alchemy rabbit hole, which included the Templars and Baphomet. But in general, generation after generation, these folks kept using a severed head metaphor. They even appropriated John the Baptist to hide their symbols out in public. It's a deep rabbit hole. Remember, Nimrod lore fixating on him getting beheaded? Worshipping the severed head had an origin. It seems to go back to Babylon. God used the flood to cleanse a corrupt world, right? Yet within 4 generations, it all fell apart, and he had to intervene with the Tower of Babel. So what went so wrong so quickly? Esagila. Just hearing the term House of the Raised Head made me think of a giant, large head that once belonged to an even larger statue. Any city or statue made before the flood would have been destroyed, right? In the murky lore surrounding Esagila, there are stories about discovering the head and restoring an ancient temple. My big problem is I'm seeing this time period through the lens of a creationist whose most literal interpretation of Bible chronology means that Nimrod stuff happened just a few hundred years after a global flood. Anything that anybody discovers from this era came from the pre-flood world. Oh, that would do. Imagine discovering the Santa beard in your parents' dresser drawer. Dad? Well, the same reality-shattering discovery would happen if you found evidence of an older world destroyed by the flood. Who were these people? What happened to them? Why would God kill them all? Now, reread Nimrod's motivation. I believe he discovered some relic that motivated him to build the tower, to avenge himself on God. That, folks, is a prime Antichrist candidate. Imagine this. Lamech's face is on the statue. So Nimrod dives into the Sons of Perdition legends and lore and decides to build a shrine to King or Head number 1. The shrine is Esagila, the House of the Raised Head. Does my theory hold any water? Well, Josephus gave me a cool nugget of support. This is what he wrote. But as to the plain of Shinar in the country of Babylonia, Hestiaeus mentions it when he says thus, such of the priests as were saved took the sacred vessels of Jupiter and Elias and came to the Shinar of Babylonia. Priests? I mean, this is long before God pegged Aaron for the Levitical priesthood. I mean, what if these guys were bad priests? These were Tower of Babel priests, after all. These guys had sacred vessels? What are these? Again, the creationist lens has Noah getting off the ark at Ararat just a few generations earlier. Nimrod is his great-grandson. This is a narrow window of time, and within it, we have priests with vessels traveling to Shinar, where Esagila was built. A big problem is that 2400 BC predates Greek and Roman mythology. There hasn't even been time for the Greek language to be created. Yet Hestasius, too many vowels there, writes that a group of priests traveled with vessels dedicated to Jupiter Idealius, whatever that name is. What's up with that? Now, Jupiter is an easy one. That's the Roman, who they didn't exist yet, name for Zeus, the god of up. Whoa, up is lofty. While the name Lamech certainly wasn't used, Jupiter is a murderous, Lamech-y god who killed his own father, Cain, to rule the world. The other world, Idealius, is very obscure. Current Greek or Roman mythology has him listed as a minor god connected to Ares, yet the word means warlike or the spirit of war. So the priests had some vessel that led them to where they found a statue of a warlike father-murdering king? We'll build the Tower of Babel here. Gather up some men. We're retaking heaven and killing God. That, folks, is my candidate number 2. Nimrod is king number 2.